Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our first lecture of 2022, DAR Genealogy Lecture Series, and our eighth in total. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Barbara Bynes Little. Here are a portion of the accomplishments of this outstanding professional genealogist. 30 years of professional presentations in 32 states on research methodology, articles in magazines of Virginia Genealogy, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the National Genealogical Society newsletter, the Board for Certification of Genealogists newsletter, and the Association of Professional Genealogists Quarterly. She was also the winner of NGS Quarterly Award of Excellence, current editor of the National Genealogical Society's Research in the States series, and has published 3 volumes of Virginia court records. She has served as coordinator and instructor of many genealogical institutes in several states while serving as board member and president of both the National Genealogical Society and the Virginia Genealogical Society. I asked Barbara to be with us because so many of our members have ancestors that might have lived in Virginia, passed through Virginia on a migration route, or once owned land there. We have patriots who served in the Revolutionary War from Virginia, and others who are brick walls for us in that state. Ladies, I bring you the ins and outs of Virginia with Barbara Bynes Little. Welcome, Barbara. I am anxious to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be with you all this evening. I guess it is afternoon maybe for you all, but this evening. Luckily, it's not last year, or last week rather. We wouldn't be here. I've been out. I was out of internet, cell phone, the whole ball of wax. You know that little storm that came through Virginia. It sort of wiped us out for a while. This afternoon, this evening, whenever you all hear this, we're going to talk about the ins and outs of Virginia migration, because the people came in and then the vast majority of them left again eventually. Some after only a generation, some after only 2 or 3 years, some after generations. It just depended. So we'll start at the very beginning. And the problem is that, I'm going to get you out of Virginia, into Virginia, out of Virginia. But then a lot of you are going to want to go further. So one of the things that I would like to recommend is back in 2008, Linda Suffrage wrote an article on migration dealing with the southern migration trails primarily. She's from Louisiana and, from Arkansas, and she knows and is familiar, because she had Virginia ancestors, how they traveled as they went west. So for those of you that are interested, I think you would find it a good read. Migration is not a simple thing. It deals with economics. People moved because they either had or wanted more money, or had little money and no incentive to stay where they were. I often have heard people say, well, if they were too poor, they couldn't move. Well, if they were too poor, they needed to move to see if they couldn't at least learn to survive somewhere else. Geography plays a major part of any migration trail, because it dictates how you got where you went. And then, of course, there are religion, politics, family dynamics, slavery, all those other things that impacted why we left, when we left, and even how we left. In the beginning, this was Virginia. You came in from the Atlantic Ocean. Let's see if I can't get you there. You come in from the Atlantic Ocean and into the Chesapeake Bay. And right over here is Jamestown. And you landed there, and very soon people started expanding up the James River. Some of them went back down the James River. Some of them went across the Chesapeake Bay into Accomack, but they all stayed in this little area right here. And it took them a few decades to get to a sizable number so that they would expand further. But if you notice, they were right along all these little tiny dots there. They were right along the river. They didn't get down or up into this area. By the 1650s, less than 50 years after they started, Virginia had a number of counties. Now, they started with the original counties down here along the river: Henrico, Charles City, James City, Elizabeth City, Accomack. Then they started adding in a few more. We'll get the next ones that they added were two down here. Now, this was south of the James. Your little James River's running right here. This was south of the James River. They could get down into this area because there were little creeks or big creeks that got part of the way down, but you notice they didn't go very far down. So this was the area of this early expansion into this southern tidewater area. Was one little county up here called Northumberland. And you wonder why it's all the way up here when everything else is down here. And the simple reason is, at that time, Northumberland was this whole area. Then it started getting split off in the next generation of counties into all of these other counties as more and more people moved up the rivers to get there. Because the rivers were the highways. They didn't have roads. They had at best paths at this point. So you have the Chesapeake Bay running down here. You have the James River, which flows into the Chesapeake Bay. The next major river is the York River, then the Rappahannock River, and finally the Potomac River. You have this little line running down here, which is known as the fall line. It means that there are rocks in the river and a drop, and as a result, you do not get boats past this point. Now, during this time period, the ocean-going vessels, such as they were not carnival size. They could go up these little creeks and rivers, and they would land at the various landings along the rivers. So you had the movement, and the rivers drew the people. We had groups who came occasionally, the Huguenots in the 1700s at Manneken. The Germans first showed up in Germania in 1714 over in the Piedmont area, and the German and Scots-Irish in the 1740s in the Valley of Virginia. There were earlier Huguenots, there were earlier Germans, and there were earlier Scots-Irish, but they were scattered. They did not show up in large groups. And most of them came via the Atlantic Ocean into the area. They started coming in from Maryland and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, by the way, relatively early in the 1700s, 1730s, 1740s in that area. You saw movement into Virginia from Maryland before that. So you always want to watch out if you've got people living along the Potomac River, along the Chesapeake Bay. You want to make sure that you're not dealing with somebody who's been moving back and forth across Maryland and Virginia. But some of the farmers would own land on both places. They saw the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River as major highways. Today, we see them as major barriers. You can only get across the Chesapeake Bay two places: down here at Norfolk with a tunnel and bridge complex, and up at Baltimore with a bridge. There is no other path, and it's almost that bad with the Potomac River. There are only about 3 bridges. But back here, it was the highway, the major highway. So you do see that movement from Maryland, and you need to be careful. You'll see it in the Northern Neck, you'll see it in people coming down into Fairfax, Prince William, Stafford, into that area. Then they start coming. You see this little line right here. That's the Blue Ridge Mountains. All right, your fall line's running right over here. It goes from Washington, D.C., down through Fredericksburg, down to Richmond. And what that means is that's your tidal basin, and that's as far as ships could get until they built canals around the falls, which they did at the Potomac and at the James River. They didn't do it at the other rivers. But at those two places, they did finally build canals so that vessels could go up and down there. But it also impacted how people got their goods to for sale down. They get goods in, they get goods out. So the closer they were to the rivers, the happier they were. The Valley of Virginia, the only way you got there was by road. And of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Great Wagon Road that ran from Philadelphia all the way down through here. Then you had all these nice little ridges again. That's the Appalachian Mountain, Allegheny Mountain chain, which starts up in Maine and goes to Georgia. Nice little barrier of mountains that effectively blocked settlement to the west. So when people were coming in, you see them here again, when they came in, this is the Blue Ridge area here in 1755, the Lower Valley. That was as far as people had gotten. Now, we're only 20 years away from the Revolutionary War at this point. Everybody was either in the Valley of Virginia or back over in Eastern Virginia. So this is the next thing you look at when you have migration. Well, where could they go? As I said, this barrier right here made it impractical to go further west. So a lot of people did. They even started up here in New Jersey. I have ancestors that came out of New Jersey in the 1740s. I have one, Benjamin Borden, that came from Rhode Island down into the Valley of Virginia in the 1730s and settled down in this area. They could go further south, but the mountains and the Indians that lived on the other side of those mountains were a major barrier. So you didn't see, prior to the 1750s, you did not see movement into this area. You didn't see movement into Tennessee at all. You saw movement into from Southside Virginia here into eastern North Carolina. You saw movement from Virginia into western North Carolina. North Carolina's land prices were cheaper. And you saw the early Germans coming down into North Carolina. Again, the land prices, Virginians were cheaper than Pennsylvania, but Carolina was even cheaper. And so they moved down this side of the mountains into this area right here. Now, there was another reason why you didn't see movement into this area except for the inching down of people who lived south of the James here. And that's because there was no way to get out. The barrier islands here stopped traffic. You couldn't get in. The first port in North Carolina is down really at Wilmington, so that there was no way for seagoing vessels to get into Carolina from this area. There was no way to get your goods out for trade. And people did not find this a good process. So they moved into the Piedmont, good farmland. It was cheap and easier to move around it. The Shenandoah Valley, when it first started being populated, if you'll notice, these lines are rivers. They're not roads. There are none. Essentially none. They're little trails, and the Great Wagon Road was not referred to as a road to start with. It was called a path, which is what it was. You traveled via foot and by horseback. You didn't have wagons going down. The other point that I would like to make is that this is the Potomac River up here. So the rivers are flowing north into the Potomac. So you actually go up the Shenandoah Valley into the Potomac River area. You don't go down from the Potomac River. Now, 100 years later, you've got railroads, you've got roads across here, you've got turnpikes. People can get where they want to go without too much effort. So the movement out following the Civil War was essentially not impeded. You could go about wherever you wanted. So what you have to look for when you have people moving after the Civil War is where could they go that they felt like they could have the life that they wanted, make the money that they needed economically, that sort of thing. So you look at the destination, what the destination did to draw them there, rather than how or why they were getting out of Virginia. In the southern Virginia, you'll notice that the mountains close in, and there looks like literally no way to get across them, and literally there wasn't. This is Tennessee, right down in here. People came down the Valley of Virginia. And notice it's narrower right here. They're not, the mountains, they're not as thick. And so you came all the way down here, even though it was a far trip, you came all the way down here so that you could wind your way through the mountains, over across, they went through Castlewood, and then they could come down here, see, nice level, and then get over, and then come over down here, and then go through the Cumberland Gap and into Kentucky and back up again. That's a long way around, but it was better than crossing these mountains. And this is why. They were essentially uncrossable. You don't get a wagon over that. You don't get a horse or a donkey over that. You don't get a man over that. And it wasn't just on this side. If you look right over here, you can see the exact same thing on the other side. Not at the top of the mountain, but part way up. And you're not going there. Different view of essentially the same thing, but you see what I mean. So people were limited in where they could cross those mountains. Now, in Northern Virginia, it wasn't quite that bad. This is over in the Allegheny Mountains in Barber County, West Virginia. And you would have little valleys, sort of not on the top of a mountain, but they were high valleys. And then you would cross a mountain, or then you would cross another mountain, and then you would cross another mountain. And it was a mountain range, remember. But between each one of these, you were liable to find another one of these little valleys that had land that you could cultivate and live in. And so they would sort of mountain leap. They'd move here, stay a while, sell their land to somebody else, make a little money, and move on to greener pastures, so to speak. So you'll see a lot of people up in that area doing what we call hopping. They'll stay for 5 years, maybe 10 even, and then they'll sell out and move on a little bit. Sometimes they'll sell out and move all the way to a high eventually, but originally it was usually just over into the next valley. The other problem early on was the Proclamation Line of 1763. The French and Indian War had effectively stopped migration almost everywhere except south. And so for 9 years, nobody made much of an inroad. But along towards the end of, went the wrong way. Long towards the end of the French and Indian War, you had this proclamation line at the end of the war, right along here. It's the crest of the Allegheny Mountains. And the proclamation said that no white man would move over here. Well, there was a small problem. They already had and they weren't about to move back. So I had to do something. Notice there are no roads over here at this point. You've got the roads going south coming from Richmond down through what was called the Occoneechee Path. It's now Interstate 85. Takes you right straight into Piedmont, North Carolina, or actually it ends up in Georgia eventually. You have 3 other roads east of the Blue Ridge that also take you down into North Carolina. And then you have the wagon road that takes you down to what is known as Roanoke today. It used to be called Big Lick, and cuts through the Roanoke River water gap and does exactly the same thing. Crosses the Dan River at Danville and comes into North Carolina. So you had all this, but you had that proclamation line that says you're not going over here, except people had already gone over there. So what do? You get a better vision here of what was settled and what wasn't at the beginning of the war in 1750. And so the proclamation line looks like it's a viable alternative. But in the 10 years, people moved. You had a huge Cherokee population in this area that kept them from here. And North Carolina was filling up, so they moved over here. And they moved over here. And the government said, you got to go back. And, well, I won't say what they said. What they did was against the king's proclamation again, but it worked out. They started making deals with the Indians. And they moved starting 1668 was the first one. They kept moving that line with Indian treaties till by 1775, with the beginning of the Revolutionary War, they were over here. They had the land to the Ohio River. So you see movement, heavy movement into this area and into Kentucky beginning in 1775 when the Kentucky area opened up. You're not going to see them before then, but you'll see them then. And then, of course, after the war, things started expanding. But I want to point something out. Kentucky was established as a state in 1792. It started being settled during the Revolutionary War. So the establishment of an active government in the area usually occurs at some time after the first settlement. Depending on the area and the time and the influx, 5 to 10 years usually is what you look at between the people first moving into an area and when you get an active government in the area, as opposed to one that's a long distance away. When you're looking at migration, there are a number of things that people, I guess what I should say is they assume things that are not true. They have what we call invalid assumptions about migration. Who was where, when, and under what conditions. And we base a lot of these, unfortunately, on our experiences today. And I just realized one this past week when I'm sitting here in my house, the electricity is off, which is not too bad. We've got a little generator, and while it won't run the heat, it will at least give us lights, you know, and we can turn on the TV and get the news. But I didn't have cell phone service. And worst of all, I didn't have the internet, so I couldn't go out and do things. And it was cold in the house, so I was shut up in the living room with my husband, who was bored stiff. And I started thinking about the pioneers who were stuck in their homes in the winter, not for 2 or 3 days, but for 2 or 3 months. It makes you think about what the conditions were back then as opposed to what they are today. And it's something we need to look at whenever we're looking at migration, because people react to the conditions of the time, not to our impressions of what they were. And an excellent example is Fort Ligonier in, this is in Pennsylvania, actually. It's 30 miles east of Pittsburgh. If you're ever in this area, you really need to go visit it. It's a reproduction. It is beautifully done. It shows you what life was like back then, and they've got some fantastic exhibits. Well, of course, this was back 1758 when it was established. Nobody was living there then. This was a fort out here to protect against the Indians, to establish our right to move there eventually. So it was manned by soldiers. So there'd be no people there, right? Except there were. Soldiers back then, frequently the professional soldiers, carried their family with them. If they were stationed somewhere, the entire family moved. And if you think about it, those of you who are old enough to remember all those old westerns we used to watch on, that where the colonel had the marriageable daughter who came out to stay with daddy and of course fell in love with the local lieutenant or whatever. The families moved with the army back then quite often. And so you will find people in an area before you really anticipate finding them sometimes. Probably the biggest invalid assumption that most people make with migration is that people moved. They packed up and they moved. You know, they packed up in Virginia and moved to California, or they packed up in Virginia and they moved to Texas or Florida or Tennessee or wherever. And then they can't figure out why they can't find them. Because they're here now, so they should have been there then, except they didn't usually do that. This is actually a rendition of a family, a man. He was born in 1784 in Loudoun County, Virginia. Okay. His family moved to Pennsylvania County, Virginia, right on the border of North Carolina, in 1787 when he was 3. Then they skipped across the border, spent a couple of years, or a little bit more. By 1800, they had moved to Tennessee. Right. Then they decided to come back to Virginia. This is Cabell County, right on the Ohio River here. He moved back to Cabell County and actually spent the next 40 years there. Then in 1849, he made his last moves. He left Cabell County and moved to Ohio. Didn't last much over 6 months there before he took off for Indiana, and then actually ended up in northern Indiana in 1849, where he died. Now, since he only moved to Indiana in 1849, the people who were chasing him knew he was born in Virginia, according to family tradition, because he didn't quite make it to the census. And they started looking for daddy, you know, in 1849 in Virginia. In Virginia, what is present day Virginia. They weren't looking in what is West Virginia, which was back then also Virginia. They made a number of invalid assumptions in the process. And an awful lot of that is because we do the Superman thing. You know, we're going to leap single, you know, we go from here to here without methodically tracking the individual from one place to another. Because it's quicker if we can do this. But it also leads to inaccuracy. And then, of course, you know, there's only one road, there's only one way to get there, which is about as invalid as you can get, except some places in West Virginia. By 1815, there were a multitude of intersecting roads that would take you north and south, east and west, you know, just take your pick. Wherever you want to go, you can get there. There were actually, even though they don't show them, there were, people that were moving down into Florida not soon after this. And there was movement there as well. Now, many of those actually follow what are interstates today. Right. Moving into Carolina, I've alluded to this a couple of times, but let's just look at two instances. This is Augusta County, right? Lexington, we're in the Valley of Virginia. Now, you can come down the Valley of Virginia, the Great Wagon Road, which comes down from Stanton, Lexington, down into Roanoke. But there was another road over here on the side of the valley that came down and along the Catawba River and down, and then it crossed over. Actually, some people went on down the Sinking Creek Road down this way. So there were actually two roads down the valley. This was just the main traveled road. So it depended a little bit on where you wanted to go, which roads you took. Come down to Roanoke, Stanton River Water Gap, and you can cut through the water gap and go over here into Piedmont, North Carolina. You can go further down and cut back in over this way. This one is a little bit shorter. This one is not as hilly. So again, if you're walking and riding a horse, you're probably going to take this one. If you've got a wagon load of stuff, you're probably going to take this one. It depends. There is a manuscript map of another road to Carolina called the Rogues Road. It was east of the Blue Ridge. It was a fascinating map. Man drew it. It actually is at the University of Virginia now. This is just a portion of it, the part where he finally got to North Carolina and Salisbury town. Talks about crossing the river. Also talks about incidences along the trail. A little boy gets killed and various other things. And you're going along reading all the little notes. And I ran across this one that said, I saw a naked lady in the field. And I thought, well, all right. But I would like to know the story behind it, the backstory, but I don't guess I ever will. And I probably wouldn't have, except they started renaming the roads, the 911, and renaming all the roads so that they could track everybody. And there was a lady here in Orange County who proposed the name of a road and threw the whole board into an uproar. Well, we can't have a naked lady lane. And so they asked her to appear and explain why she wanted to name the road the Naked Lady Lane. She got up and she looked at him. She says, well, but there's a whole field of naked ladies on the road. It's a wildflower. And so we quite often, when we're reading about incidents that happen on the trail, we need to look a little deeper into what the story really was about and what was going on. I think these are the renditions of the various roads that get you into North Carolina, which is, to be quite frank, up until the Revolutionary War, this is where everybody went. Now they would move on down to South Carolina. I had an ancestor who qualifies the Society of Cincinnati. By the end of the war, he had moved from Fairfax County all the way down into Carolina, where he died. Some of his family, though, and this is the other thing you have to watch out for, because he moved with family. The family, after his death, moved back. And so you see them up and back in Fairfax County, and then they migrate again. His brother moves into Greenbrier County area of West Virginia. His wife remarries and moves into the central Shenandoah Valley. So you also have to watch for those who come and then go back as well when you're looking for migrations. Not everybody goes and stays. I had a great-great-grandfather that went all the way out to to Iowa, stayed for about 4.5 years, had a child, had 2 children out there, one of whom died, came back to West Virginia, spent the rest of his life there. So you will get those migrations that bounce back. And sometimes you will get migrations that bounce back more than once. They get drawn back maybe because of an aging parent, um, because they've had crop failures, for any of a number of reasons, but they keep trying and eventually they succeed. But those are the ones that it's really hard. You know, those that go back and forth, you have extreme difficulty figuring out who they are and what they are. You always want to look at where people come and go. And when you're talking about it, I've talked about all these people coming down into North Carolina. Well, there were also people, because they could get in through Wilmington and through Charleston, ships would land, and they don't like Georgia and South Carolina, primarily because there were a lot of Indians in this area here, not much land. Most of them were not used to the coastal plains, especially the Scots Irish and the Germans. And so they tended to go north up here into North Carolina, as opposed to staying in this area. Now, the problem with this is that they mix well with the Germans and the Scots Irish coming down the valley. And it is extremely difficult a lot of times to determine whether you've got someone who came in this way or whether you have someone who came in this way, especially if they have one of the more common family names. But so you have to watch out for that. You cannot assume that because they're Scots Irish or German and they're in the Piedmont of North Carolina area that they came down from Virginia. Now, conversely, if you find them in this area of North Carolina, you can be pretty sure that they had been in Virginia prior to that, because it's extremely difficult to get into this area of North Carolina any other way. And this is where most of your settlement came in. There are a few exceptions, but this is because there you've got the Outer Banks that completely block any ships coming in until you get down to Wilmington. It's the only port that you have. And so the tendency is to go up here where there is open land and settlement. So you need to watch for these patterns as well. And it's not just to Carolina where they follow a single trail. You want to get to Kentucky? Well, the easiest way is by the Ohio River. Once you get over the Allegheny Mountains, and they're not as thick and hard to get over in Northern Virginia and Maryland, Pennsylvania, as they are in Southwest Virginia. So you can go over there and go down the Ohio River. There are two problems. One are the Indians, who tended to attack the flatboats that went down the river. And the other is it took money because you had to buy a boat or pay for it to be built. So the poor class went one of the southern routes. Or you could wait, and eventually they'll build a railroad and make travel a lot easier, but that's going to be some time. You're going to get there. Or the Parkersburg Turnpike, which is in the northern part of West Virginia. But again, you're looking into almost the mid-1800s before people are going to start traveling that route. One of the first routes is the Kanawha River route through central West Virginia. You would go over to Lexington and then to Covington and through the mountains over to Lewisburg and beyond, and then finally reach the falls of the Kanawha River and take the Kanawha River by boat down to the Ohio, and then take the Ohio River down to Kentucky. Or you could go further south and take the Wilderness Trail and do the whole thing by land. Or you could go further south and take the Tennessee River, going down the Holston or the Clinch, going all the way to the southern border of Tennessee, all the way back up to the Ohio River, and then back up the Ohio River to get to the area of Kentucky that you wanted to go to. It was a long, involved journey, but we do have some extant diaries of people who made that trip. It was also a dangerous journey because there were places where they could also be attacked by Indians. And finally, remember that roads go both ways. This is a group of reenactors crossing the Watauga River in between Tennessee and North Carolina. Now, they were over here at Sycamore Shoals, and they came down to Kings Mountain to fight at Kings Mountain. Now, the people who were here at Sycamore Shoals were Virginians. They'd come down the Shenandoah Valley into this area and settled. A lot of them from the northern Shenandoah area region. Sevier was one of those, a Huguenot who had settled in the valley and came down. But they joined the others to fight at the Battle of Kings Mountain and other battles in North Carolina. And so they had a path. And when people wanted to go to Tennessee later on from North Carolina, some of them followed that path and back across through the mountains there. It wasn't an easy trek, but it would get them. Others went up further in North Carolina and picked up the Wilderness Road and across. But this is their track, and as you can see, they're sitting here at Sycamore Shoals. They come down through this branch of the mountains, then they can get a low-lying valley-like area for part of it before they crossed another piece of the mountains. And then they've got flat land into Kings Mountain. If they'd gone further up, they would have been across the mountains the whole way. A lot of people from this area would follow this road up and go across and come up into the Reedy Creek area. And actually, you find a lot of Virginians who come to North Carolina and settle, stay for a generation, move back up into this area and stay for about a generation before they move on to Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana. So you never want to assume that people don't backtrack. They can and they do. West through Pennsylvania will take you across Braddock's Road, which actually was a road, not a trail. Right across through and that's the way most people went to get to Pittsburgh and go down the Ohio Valley, go down the Ohio River. You do get a few people who followed Braddock's Road here rather than Forbes Road. They want to go to the Forks of Ohio so that they can take the road down. And here you have Forbes Road coming across here. Braddock's Road starts at Winchester and comes down in this way, and it was a much rougher road. It was the first of the two that was built. But they actually were roads. Both of them carried wagons. And this is a point I'd like to make. Those were large Conestoga wagons. The driver walked behind the wagon. He didn't ride. Nobody rode. Everybody walked, unless it were small children. But all of those people who, teamsters, who followed the soldiers and carried they were teamsters. They weren't soldiers. And they saw the land and they carried the stories back. And so one of the things when you're looking for migration is you want to look at the people who were there for reasons other than, so a lot of the things that drove the migration in North and South Carolina after the Revolutionary War, because they saw the land and the opportunities and they came back and packed up their family and moved. The Wilderness Trail was not a road until after 1794. For the first 20 years of settlement along the Wilderness Trail, you did not see these wagons. The trail looked more like that. Okay? You carried your goods on horseback or cows. They would even pack goods on cows, and they would walk the entire way. Your flatboats, of course, could carry furniture. People who had the money, they could take their horses, cattle, and everything down the river. It was a much easier travel. And they continued. Soon you saw them going all the way down to Louisiana. But you had to worry about Indian attacks, and they were well fortified. Later on, you'll see the National Road going across, following part of Forbes Road, going across Pennsylvania into Ohio, and people from Virginia will go up and get on the National Road and go across. That's the way most of them would move into Ohio later times. And even there, where they would cross, they would come down to Zane's Trace and into Maysville, Kentucky, and into Kentucky that way as well. But this is much later on, and Zane's Trace was not a road for a number of, it was in the 1800s before it ever became a road. It was walking too. Later on, as I said, you will get the turnpikes and the railroads, and people could move much more rapidly across the area. The Kanawha River Road actually opened in 1785 to Lewisburg, and by 1790, I think it was, they actually opened it all the way to Charleston. This shows you again going across and picking up Kanawha. They're going through Stanton and picking up Kanawha and going down that way to the area. So you have eventually 3 major ways to get west in the 1800s. You have numerous ways to get south. And after the 1800s, you will start seeing the movements go forward to the other areas. Now, I want to skip a couple of, I was going to spend a little time on the Wilderness Road, but I want to skip over that since we have talked about it at length, because I do want to cover one other thing. That's just another view of what you were facing on the Wilderness Road, by the way. If that wasn't enough to send you back home, I don't know what I was. This is a picture of the Cumberland Gap, and you can see on either side of it how the roads go. The blockhouse here was as far as the wagons could go. The rest of the way you walked. And then this is your Tennessee River route that takes you all the way down to the Tennessee River and all the way back up and into Louisville. A long trip. But to some, again, you could take all of your goods, and so it was worth it. This is the first area that was settled in this area. You saw very little settlement in southern West Virginia. Almost all of it was moving over into Kentucky after the Revolutionary War. And now you see your patterns out of Pennsylvania, down and around, and then up into Kentucky and across, all of them going. Now, this is post-Revolutionary War or even during the Revolutionary War. Before that, we saw the patterns moving down in this area. By the 1850s, you could get there from anywhere. Happy traveling.
Thank you so much, Barbara. How fascinating and informative. You have presented us a supercharged lesson on Virginia and migration trails. I was excited personally to hear your presentation, and that was well founded. We do have some questions for you. I think you've answered some of them, but you might want to expand a little bit on them. So we'll look at question number 1. Do we have insights into why family groups migrated together? You addressed that, but would you like to say a quick answer to that?
Very simply, number one, you had to have the support. wagons break down, wheels break, people get sick. There are Indians. You can't fight them off by yourself. Moving in groups was a way to feel reasonably comfortable. Most of us, as single individuals, do not like to encounter anything new on our own. We tend to get somebody to go with us. And when you're migrating, that somebody just happens to be a bigger group of somebodies. And it's for the same reason, the security and the safety, really, of the individuals.
Right. And they intermarried and became family.
Well,
Kin,
they
so to
actually,
speak.
a lot of times it was the kin that moved. Now, you got to
Right.
be careful there because that kin might be the wife's kin, not the groom's kin. In other words, you've got the husband and the wife. Sometimes you move with the husband's family, sometimes you move with the wife's family. And that's when you start getting your families to split. But what you want to watch for is, so one son moves to Tennessee and with his wife's family, and another son moves to North Carolina with a brother. All three of them may end up in Kentucky together as they move on, because they will get messages and information back and forth. They both become dissatisfied or want something new, and so they'll join together even at the next generation up. So this is the other thing that you see, is that these family ties intertwine, and they don't remain necessarily static, but there is always this sort of coming back together again.
That's a great point. Thank you for that. All right, question number 2. What was the biggest attraction for migrating during the mid 1700s?
Land. As the eastern part of the area filled up, because that's where everybody came in, is from the ocean.
Right.
As that filled up, land became more expensive, land wore out as they planted tobacco, and the Indians moved further west so that there was more of an opening there. But the other reason is that the government wanted expansion. So that in the actually in the earlier 1700s and then 1720, I think it was 1726, they actually offered 7 years of no taxes to people who would move into the Orange, Spotsylvania area and down into the Pennsylvania, Halifax County area. If they moved in there, they'd have 7 years tax free. They were doing two things. One, again, was creating a barrier against the Indians, creating more that, and so people moved. I mean, people move, they don't have to pay taxes.
Right. And they didn't make the tax list, right?
They didn't make the tax list, and of course, those don't survive for the most part for that area. But it was there was one, people needed to find land because it was too expensive back where it was a settled area, and the government also offered that initiative because the people who were in power in the government wanted to make money, and a lot of them had bought up huge pieces of land, and then they would sell chunks of it and make a profit. And they would be selling it to people who were moving in because they didn't have to pay taxes, so they were happy too.
Very good. Question number 3. Are there anecdotes of people returning to Virginia? If so, what was the primary reason?
You know, we know that they came back. I mean, I know that my great-grandfather came back from Iowa. Nobody in the family could ever tell me why. Now, the one thing that I haven't explored that I think probably was one of the intervening factors is, if you move on a shoestring and you have 1 year of bad crops for usually weather, you can maybe struggle through. But if you have 2 years of bad crops, you're in trouble. And so sometimes that I do know happens, where people just absolutely could not financially make it. They ran into seasonal weather, their crops failed, and so they had to come back home. The Skaggs family that I mentioned, I had tracked him in the taxes, and I happened to run across, well, it wasn't my direct line, and I happened to end up in a correspondence with a lady who had come from that line. And I said, well, I just don't understand. He is here for a while, and then he disappears for 4 or 5 years, and he comes back. Actually came back 3 times before he left for good. And she said, every time it was family. His mother got sick, then his dad got sick, and then they were trying to settle the estate, and so he had to come back for that. And so he would come back and stay for 2 or 3 years, but he kept going back. So there are varied reasons. And maybe, I suspect, more often than not, wives would get lonesome. They would want the family support they don't have, especially if they moved with a husband's family. So you have all of those interplaying reasons. It's just like today.
Yes,
why do
right.
people move?
Right.
That there is no single reason. Some people move because they're scared. Other people, the Indians are here. The other people say they're not going to run me out. It depends.
Okay, thank you. Question number 4. Beyond tobacco production, what made Virginia so attractive to European immigrants?
Well, of course, it was economics or religious freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't as much religious freedom in a lot of instances. You did get the Roman Catholic movement in to Maryland, and then when things went wrong there, as far as that was concerned, you saw them slide down into Virginia. The Huguenots came because they were promised freedom of religion. The first Germans that came were brought over as miners because they thought they could, and it was an economic thing, but they were also promised that they would have their own religion. They could have their own minister, and that's sort of what nobody told these people was, you could do that, but you still got to support the local minister too with your taxes. So that didn't fare very well. But they were after economic and religious freedom, primarily economic freedom. And you see, once they move into the Piedmont, tobacco really does not become the major agricultural product. It's wheat. And in the Valley of Virginia, there is no question it's wheat. Again, you get the Scots, Irish, and the Germans who are more acclimated to growing grain anyway. Grain was not a big product in the British Isles necessarily because you didn't have the large fields. But tobacco production was simply because you could make money. And they could make money in a number of ways, and that's what they were after. They wanted that economic opportunity that they couldn't get.
And 4. All right, question number 5. During the colonial times, was migration out of Virginia primarily the men who later sent for their families, or did entire families tend to leave together?
Again, it depended.
Right.
For example, one of the interesting migratory groups that left Virginia left right at Spotsylvania County here nearby. They left during the Revolutionary War. An entire church, it's called the Traveling Church, an entire church, Baptist church, got together, packed up, and left, went to Kentucky. They took their families and they all moved at one time. A lot of times what you will see is that the men will go ahead for a year or at least for 6 months because they need to create a structure to move into, and they want to plant, and get a crop. It depends a little bit on when you see them leave. If they leave in the fall, it probably means that they're moving as a group together, and that they plan on planting the crop then in the spring. They'll prepare during the winter and plant the crop in the spring. If you see them leave in the spring, the guy's probably leaving by himself. And you won't even notice that because it's difficult. It is really difficult to track them other than in tax records. And that's when the man goes off the tax list. And there again, you have to, he would still be taxed as a resident because he hadn't moved, he's just not home. And so you wouldn't know that he is in Kentucky or Tennessee or wherever, building a house. So again, it depends.
Okay, question number 6, please. Do you have a favorite migration in or out of Virginia story?
I have so many migration stories.
I've noticed that. It's wonderful.
Well, it's fascinating when you look at it because no two are ever the same. They are a variety of reasons and events, and I guess my favorite ones are always the ones where I find the only way you make the connection is with, an unusual record group or something. And I recently had one which makes that probably will end up publishing it in the magazine of Virginia Genealogy. It's one that came to me. I did not do the research on this one. It's a woman's family, and she's tracking the man back out of Bedford County, and she gets him into Pennsylvania County, and he's sitting there, and she starts looking at the records, and he's getting sued by this man from Orange County. So she goes to look up the man in Orange County, and lo and behold, the same suit is in Orange County. What happens is you have to sue somebody in the county in which they reside. So the man had been living in Orange County. He gets sued. He moves. so the guy who's suing him follows him and sues him in that county, sends a lawyer and sues him in that county. And you've got your perfect link. I mean, you can prove that this is the same guy, and it's the only way you can prove it. It literally is the only way you can prove it. And so, those are the stories that stick because it's that just odd little thing that happens that allows you to make the connection.
That is a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. All right, question 7. Once families left Virginia, was there a typical continued migration, or did most families remain in their adopted state territory after just one relocation? And you addressed that pretty thoroughly a while ago. The north and south and west they went.
They do, and I'll tell you what really taught me that to begin with is when you read Revolutionary War pension files.
Yeah.
You read, well, I was born here, then I went there, then I enlisted here, then I moved there, then I moved there, and you track them all over the place. There are so many of those. You have to sit there and say, well, maybe part of it is because they were strong enough to live long enough to get a pension, but they did. I mean, you have story after story after story, and they don't move one place and stay. Now, my ancestors all did. They came from everywhere from Ashe County, North Carolina, from Pennsylvania, from New Jersey, from Rhode Island, and they ended up in this little hole in a valley in West Virginia, and they couldn't get out. And so they stayed there. I do not have an ancestor who was not born, who was not here before the Revolution.
Wow.
And they all ended up in that little hole in West Virginia eventually. And I descend from multitudes of people from various places, but it's most people do relocate numerous times. And you will usually find at least one person from every family who leaves.
Yes, and the farther west they went, less records we have. That's
We
rich.
do. It is.
Rich. It's rich
But
the church was in one place.
well, you have to watch for the one thing that you have to watch for. Helen Leary used to talk about this. She says, I can find almost everybody but the nephew who moves to wherever his uncle lived. And well, and see, my father did that. He was born in West Virginia, and his grandfather lost the family farm there and moved back east into Virginia, and along with my grandfather. And so Dad was here during the Depression, and he helped build a local school here. And of course, after that job ran out, he didn't have a job, so he went back to West Virginia to live with an uncle.
Mm,
And he
okay.
got a job there and stayed. And so that's the one thing that most of us, don't think about, is the fact that a lot of people actually did tap into relatives that had already moved. And a lot of
Right.
times it was a generation later that they tapped into them, but they knew them. That's why they ended up there. And that's what you need to look for. There is a family connection. Now, it may be an aunt who doesn't have the family name, and that one really is difficult, but you end up tracking all the kids, and eventually you figure it out.
Right.
You just have to work at it.
Okay, let's see what's question 8. Is there any pattern of younger sons who didn't stand to inherit the family farm migrating more often than their eldest male sibling?
Okay, so as long as you're pre-revolution, probably, because the eldest son inherited the family farm, and daddy usually bought, if he had enough money, he would buy pieces of land, usually cheap pieces of land out, closer to the frontier, and those would go to his younger sons, and he would give them to them before he died or in his will. After primogeniture was eliminated and all children inherited equally, you will frequently find that it is the youngest son who stays and the older ones who leave. And people don't think about that. But
And the youngest son usually took care of the mother.
Took care of the mother. He was the last one to leave, so of course, he was semi-obligated.
Right.
He was the only one left, and so there it is. And so you see the pattern shift when the inheritance laws changed.
Okay, let's go to question 9. Do you have a favorite repository of lineage information for those seeking to identify ancestors living in Virginia during the Revolutionary War? Of course, our ladies are interested in residents during the Revolutionary War as part of their application and supplemental processes.
Oh, there's no question. It's the Library of Virginia.
Right.
All right. They do have now county records. Virginia county records are now available through Family Search online, so you can get to a lot of material there. And they actually have, in addition, a lot of the state records, especially the patents and grants and that sort of thing. But it's the tax records, and they do have the personal property tax records to 1850. From 1782 to 1850 because these are state records, not county records. I mean, they are county records in the sense that they were generated at the county level, but they sent a copy to the state. And so when the county had a courthouse fire, the state didn't. And even though the state had a courthouse fire in 1865 that essentially eliminated everything, the tax records were stored in a different building, and so they survived. They were part of the auditor's papers, and so those are the quickest and easiest way to identify residents during the the period. You can pick them up in 1782, right after the war, and track them forward. And so that, and by the way, so the 1783 tax list is actually considered sufficient proof of service to warrant entry
Right.
into the DAR. So
Right.
that's also there. But that is the one best record. Now, there are auditors' papers, and Bevan Creel, who works for the DAR,
Right.
is one of the examiners there. Whether you all know him or not, has published multitudes of volumes. I don't even know which volume. I just found out the other night that he'd done one on Louisa County I didn't know about. He publishes them on Lulu. And what he does is he goes through each county that he's done. He's done a couple on the auditor's papers, which are very good because they cover the state. But most of his others, he goes through the order books for the period of the war and transcribes them, abstracts or transcribes them, fully indexed. And so you get, you pick up a lot of people that don't own land, that you may not know is there. You get jury service, for example. So that those two things are probably the best way and the quickest way to identify ancestors in Virginia during the Revolutionary War.
Okay. Thank you again, Barbara. What a treat to have you. We could spend a week with you listening to your information. Great answers and such help for the genealogist or the family researcher. Our next lecture of the series will be Craig Robert Scott with Finding Women, Maiden Name Unknown. Until we meet again, I leave you with this thought. This is a famous quotation that could be applied to genealogy. Get your facts first, then you can distort them as you please. Mark Twain. Thank you for being with us.